Hola? What's the weather like where you are today? Sunny, rainy, cloudy? Comment below.
It was a sweltering Saturday in July when I stood on the sun-bleached deck of our family's lake house, squinting into the afternoon haze as my mother handed my younger sister the keys to a gleaming white yacht. Yes, a yacht, not a boat, not a speedboat. A full-on luxury, ocean-ready vessel, parked like a status symbol at the edge of our dock, as though it had always belonged there. Everyone clapped, everyone cheered, even Dad tried to put on a smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. And then there was me, who stood there with a plastic cup of lemonade in my hand, sweating through my sundress, watching my mother beam at Emily like she'd just handed her the keys to the kingdom. "Maybe you'll get there someday," she said to me, without missing a beat, without an ounce of irony or warmth. She said it like I was some struggling temp worker, and not the woman who had pulled herself out of divorce, debt, and 2 layoffs without asking anyone, especially not her, for help. I smiled. I smiled because if I didn't, I might have laughed, or cried, or told them all what I really thought of this little reunion charade we had every 4 years, like clockwork. I smiled because I had already written a letter to Dad earlier that morning, a quiet, carefully worded note that didn't yell or accuse or dramatize, but instead planted a truth I had sat on for almost 2 years. And when I saw his face fall as he picked it up later that evening after the champagne corks had popped and Mom had made her little toast to success, family, and future legacies, I knew the first domino had tipped. The thing is, when you're the older sister, the one who doesn't make waves, who holds back the biting remarks and remembers birthdays and checks in when someone's in the hospital, people start to expect your silence like it's part of the furniture. Emily, on the other hand, has always been loud, shiny, quick to charm a crowd, and quicker to forget anyone not in her direct spotlight. It was Emily who dropped out of college, floated through a series of boyfriends, a failed podcast, a boutique clothing store that closed within a year, and somehow still managed to be the golden child. Mom never batted an eye. She'd just shake her head and say, "Emily's just finding her path." While I was out there in the trenches, paying bills, holding down 2 jobs during the recession, getting promoted, making things happen without a single bailout. So yeah, I had feelings when I saw that yacht. Not jealousy, that would have been too simple. It was more like a quiet, bone-deep ache mixed with something bitter, something I hadn't let surface until I saw Mom's smirk. It was the smirk that broke me, like she knew I was watching and wanted me to feel the sting. And even then, I played my part. I smiled. I asked Dad to help dock the yacht right in front of everyone, knowing full well he's always been terrible at maneuvering boats, even small ones. I handed him the rope, made a little show of pretending to struggle with the bumper lines, and sure enough, within minutes he'd misjudged the turn and scraped the whole starboard side against the dock railing. There was a crunch, a splash, a silence, and then Mom's sharp intake of breath as the perfect fiberglass fantasy got its first scar. I acted surprised. "Oh no, Dad, are you okay? That thing's tricky, huh?" Emily was already screaming. "Are you serious? You let him dock it?" I raised my eyebrows. "He said he knew what he was doing." Dad looked at me, confused and red-faced, and I saw the hint of betrayal in his eyes. It was a petty move, I admit, but I needed to feel something other than small, something other than forgotten. Later that evening, after the tension had mostly passed and Emily was sulking in her room, I slipped Dad the letter. I didn't give it to him directly. I just left it folded under his coffee mug on the porch table where he liked to sit and pretend he wasn't eavesdropping on family drama. I watched from inside as he picked it up, opened it slowly, and began to read. And I watched the color drain from his face. I didn't need to see him finish it to know it had landed. The letter wasn't a confession. It wasn't some emotional breakdown or desperate plea for attention. It was a single, focused truth I knew he'd buried. A truth that would make him question everything he thought he understood about Mom, about Emily, and maybe about me. I didn't tell him what to do with the information. I didn't make demands. I just reminded him of something he once told me when I was 17 and scared about choosing the wrong college. He said, The truth always finds a way to come out one way or another. And then I reminded him what the truth was. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because I felt guilty, but because I couldn't stop playing out all the ways this could end. Would he confront Mom? Would he pretend he never read it? Would he tell Emily? I didn't know, but I knew one thing. That smile Mom gave me when she handed Emily those keys, that was the last time she'd smile, without wondering what I knew. The morning after the yacht incident dawned like any other at the lake house, with the glassy surface of the water glinting under the rising sun and the sound of a lawn sprinkler hissing faintly in the distance. But there was something different in the air, something dense and heavy and quiet, like the kind of silence that settles in just before a thunderstorm. I was already awake, had been since 5, lying there in the small guest bedroom with its crooked blinds and ancient ceiling fan, listening to the old boards creak as the house slowly came alive. Down the hall, I could hear Mom's laugh, light, sharp, just a little too high-pitched, and Dad's low murmur, always just below audible, like he was trying to make himself small, even in his own home. I knew the letter had done something. I didn't know what exactly, but the energy was different. And when I came downstairs and found Dad sitting at the kitchen table, the letter folded neatly beside his untouched coffee, I knew without question that the words I'd written had struck him somewhere he hadn't expected to be hit. He didn't say anything to me when I entered, didn't even look up at first. His fingers tapped a slow, uncertain rhythm against the formica tabletop, while Mom flitted behind him, humming as she cracked eggs and poured pancake batter into a pan. Like it was any other family reunion morning, like she hadn't handed my sister a floating palace yesterday, and dismissed me with a smile that barely counted as acknowledgement. It was surreal, watching her bustle around in her perfectly ironed linen outfit, acting like she didn't notice the tension thickening the room. Emily hadn't come down yet, and I could only assume she was still licking her wounds over the yacht scratch, likely blaming everyone but herself for what happened. That was her way. Rage first, reality later. When Dad finally looked up at me, his eyes were glassy in a way I hadn't seen since his brother's funeral, the kind of look that made my stomach tighten because it said everything and nothing at once. He didn't ask me why I'd written what I did, didn't deny any of it either. He just nodded once, slow and deliberate, as if we were sharing a moment no one else in the room was privy to. That was the moment I knew I had opened something in him, something maybe he had been pretending not to see for far too long. Breakfast went on awkwardly. The table was quiet except for Mom's forced small talk and the sound of silverware against plates. When Emily finally appeared, sunglasses on, lips tight, still in the silk pajamas she insisted on wearing like she was royalty slumming it, she didn't say a word to me. She sat down, poured herself orange juice, and started scrolling through her phone like she was above the whole thing. Mom, of course, doted on her, asking if she'd slept okay, if she wanted avocado toast instead, if the bed was too firm. It was nauseating. I sat there cutting into my pancakes with a precision I didn't feel, pretending to be part of a family that had long since stopped pretending to care about pretending. Later that afternoon, I made my next move, not out of spite, but because I needed to push the curtain back just a little more, to make them look at each other without the filters they'd grown so comfortable hiding behind. A few months ago, completely by accident, I'd stumbled upon a voicemail from Mom to Emily while I was helping Dad transfer files off his old phone. Something about arranging the perfect moment to give her the yacht, followed by a laugh that didn't sound like a laugh so much as a smirk wrapped in lipstick. "She's used to being overlooked," Mom had said, her voice low but smug. "She won't make a scene." I had saved the file without even thinking about it. At the time, I told myself I wouldn't do anything with it. But now, with Dad finally seeing things more clearly and the wound still fresh, it felt right. I waited until dinner. Everyone was gathered in the backyard, sitting around the fire pit, plates on their laps, glasses of wine half drunk. Emily was bragging to one of our cousins about the yacht again, explaining specs she didn't understand, while Mom smiled along like a proud investor watching her startup finally launch. I pulled out my phone, tapped the screen a few times, and then, very casually, held it near the Bluetooth speaker we used for music. The message played loud and clear, the background noise quieting to a stunned hush as Mom's voice echoed across the patio. She's used to being overlooked. She won't make a scene. The silence that followed wasn't immediate. It took a beat, like everyone had to process what they'd just heard. And then heads turned, eyes narrowed, forks paused midair. Emily looked like someone had slapped her. Mom's face went slack for a half-second before she recovered, trying to laugh it off like some kind of inside joke no one else could possibly understand. "Oh, please," she said. "That's just... We were joking around, that was nothing." But the damage was done. Dad stood up slowly, set his drink down, and walked inside without a word. Cousin Mark stared at his shoes. Aunt Lynn whispered something to her husband. And Emily, for the first time in maybe her entire life, didn't have anything to say. Later, when the crowd had mostly dispersed, and the fire was down to glowing coals, I walked out to the edge of the dock alone and stood there, listening to the night sounds, the occasional frog, the soft lap of water. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel cruel. I felt justified. And then I heard footsteps behind me, light but not careful. I turned slowly, expecting maybe Emily, maybe even Mom, coming to unload whatever storm they had brewing. But it wasn't either of them. It was someone I hadn't expected at all. The sound of those footsteps behind me, soft against the weathered boards of the dock yet deliberate enough to make my spine stiffen, wasn't like Emily's sharp, confident clatter or Mom's impatient heels. It was slower, unsure, but not timid, which is how I knew before even turning that it had to be Dad. Because when a man has spent the better part of 3 decades quietly folding himself into the spaces his wife left behind, every movement becomes more like a suggestion than a statement, every word a maybe instead of a must. And still, when I turned and met his eyes in the low light of the porch lamp behind him, there was something about the way he held my gaze that made me think, for the first time in years, that maybe the quiet wasn't cowardice after all, but a strategy. He didn't say anything, didn't need to really. The way he stood there, hands in the pockets of his windbreaker, shoulders slightly hunched against the chill, told me he was wrestling with a dozen different things at once. Guilt, confusion, maybe even the realization that silence hadn't protected anyone after all. We stood there for a minute, him watching the water like it might tell him what to do next, and me waiting for him to break the silence. But when it didn't come, I turned back toward the house, toward the throb of awkward energy still pulsing inside its walls, and told him quietly that I'd be upstairs if he wanted to talk. I didn't go straight to my room, though. Something tugged at me as I passed the hallway that led to the upstairs bedrooms, a soft echo of laughter, muffled and too deliberate, the kind of laugh people use when they're trying to sound casual while hiding something that most definitely isn't. I stopped, waited, heard it again. Mom and Emily, whispering low but urgently, and without thinking, I stepped carefully toward the corner, just close enough to catch pieces of their words without being seen. The hallway was dim, the only light coming from under the closed door at the end, where Emily had set up camp like some wounded duchess, waiting for her court to come comfort her. "You can't let her get away with this," Emily was saying, her voice tight, trembling with rage and something else, something that sounded like fear. "She made you look like an idiot in front of everyone." "I didn't know she had that recording," Mom snapped back, her voice not trembling at all, but clipped and measured, like she was already planning her next move. "Of course I wouldn't have said that if I'd known she could use it." There was a pause, then the soft creak of a bed or a chair shifting, and then Mom again, quieter now. "We have to control the story before it controls us. Your father's already acting strange. If she turns him against me..." "She already has," Emily hissed. "He barely looked at me all day. This was supposed to be my weekend." I didn't stay to hear more. I'd heard enough. Back in my room, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the peeling wallpaper across from me, my hands shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the slow, bubbling realization that what I had suspected for years was true. Mom didn't just play favorites out of habit or blind affection. She did it with strategy, with intention, and now, with me stepping out of the shadow she had spent years pushing me into, I had become a threat. And just like that, I knew what I had to do. I didn't bother trying to be subtle. The next morning, over a half-hearted breakfast of leftover quiche and tension-soaked small talk, I announced, loudly enough for the cousins and aunts still lingering around the coffee machine, that I'd found a few old photo albums and thought it would be fun to share some memories later that afternoon. Mom's eyes narrowed instantly, the corners of her mouth twitching like she wanted to object but couldn't without seeming obvious, and Emily just rolled her eyes, probably assuming I'd pulled together a slideshow of childhood embarrassment for everyone to mock. What they didn't know was that I had slipped a flash drive into the bottom of one of those albums, and on that flash drive was the full audio recording, not just the short clip from the night before, but the entire voicemail, including the part where Mom had listed off every favor, every lie, every manipulation she'd used over the years to prop up Emily's carefully constructed image, down to the time she'd quietly paid off Emily's credit card debt and told Dad it was a donation to a women's shelter. I hadn't intended to go nuclear, but now that I knew they were planning something of their own, I figured it was only fair. When the whole family gathered that afternoon in the great room, the big TV humming and the old leather chairs creaking under the weight of aging uncles and restless cousins, I kept my tone cheerful, breezy even, as I plugged in the drive and clicked play. The beginning was innocent enough. Photos of us as kids, Christmas mornings, birthday parties, that one disastrous camping trip where Emily cried because the air mattress had a hole. But then the audio began. Quiet at first, background noise, a voice saying, "You can't let her get away with this," and then louder, clearer, undeniable. The room froze. Mom stood up halfway, then sat down again, her face pale and unreadable. Emily turned crimson, her mouth opening and closing without words. And Dad just stared at the screen, his hands clenched around the armrests like he was holding on for dear life. When the recording ended, I turned off the TV, looked around the room, and smiled. Small, calm, the way someone does when they've just finished cleaning a wound they'd ignored for too long. I just thought, I said softly, that it was time we all remembered things as they actually were. And then I walked out. I didn't go far, just to the hallway, where the walls still echoed with secrets. But I needed a moment alone. That was when I heard the door open behind me, footsteps approaching, quicker this time, more determined. But once again, it wasn't who I thought. When I heard those footsteps coming toward me in the hallway, brisk, direct, full of purpose, and something else that might have been adrenaline or maybe disbelief, I expected to turn and see Emily charging toward me, ready to scream or sob, or more likely, some overdramatic combination of the two. But instead, when I turned around, I found Dad standing there with a look on his face that I hadn't seen since I was 13. And he caught a neighbor's kid spray painting our garage, a mix of stern, confused, and quietly rattled, like a man who had just realized the ground beneath his feet might not be as solid as he had spent years pretending it was. He didn't speak right away, and neither did I, because the air between us felt like a minefield. One step too early, one word too sharp, and we'd be right back where we always were. Him looking for peace, me trying not to seem like I was asking for too much, and both of us silently agreeing that maybe pretending things were fine was easier than finding out they weren't. But then he stepped closer, reached into the back pocket of his jeans, and pulled out the letter I'd written. The one I had left beneath his coffee mug on the porch 2 days before, now folded into a neat little square, creased like it had been opened and read again and again, as though the words inside had refused to stay quiet. He held it up but didn't offer it back to me. "Is it true?" he asked, voice low and careful, the kind of careful people use when they're scared of the answer, but more scared of not asking. All of it? And because I had no reason to lie, not anymore, not after what I'd already started, I nodded, not defensively, not dramatically, just with the calm that comes from knowing you've finally spoken a truth that deserved to be spoken. "Yes," I said, and it came out easier than I expected. Every word, The letter, in case you're wondering, wasn't about the yacht or the voicemail or even the favoritism, not directly. It was about something older, something heavier, something I'd been holding onto since the last family reunion 4 years ago, when I overheard Mom on the phone late at night, her voice sharp and hushed, telling someone, I still don't know who, that she was worried about Dad's memory, that he was slipping, that he'd forgotten his bank pin again and called her by the wrong name twice in a week. I didn't think much of it at the time, chalked it up to Mom's flair for the dramatic, but then I started noticing it too. The small lapses, the repeating stories, the way he'd ask where the car keys were even though they'd been in the same place for 20 years. I brought it up once, carefully, gently, and Mom waved me off like I was being ridiculous, like aging was just a thing people love to exaggerate, and Dad, for his part, just smiled in that absent-minded way and said he was fine, said everything was fine. But I knew it wasn't. I knew she was hiding it, not from him. He knew, even if he didn't want to admit it, but from the rest of the family, from the world, from me. The letter was my way of telling him that I saw it, that I wasn't pretending, that I was ready to help him face it if he was willing to stop letting her make the decisions alone. It was my way of saying, I know, and I'm here, and you don't have to do this alone. So when he looked at me in that hallway, letter in hand, eyes wet with something that wasn't quite sadness and wasn't quite fear, and whispered, I thought I was hiding it well. I just shook my head, stepped closer, and said, You were, to everyone else, but not to me. And that was the moment, right there in that outdated hallway, with the ugly green carpet and the family photos tilted on the wall, that he became my ally, not because we suddenly agreed on everything, not because he was going to charge into the next room and confront Mom like a hero in a movie, but because, for the first time, we were both standing on the same side of the truth. We didn't talk much after that, just stood there a while, the quiet between us comfortable for once. And then I said I needed to go for a walk, to clear my head, and he nodded like he understood, like he needed to clear something too. I walked down the path behind the house, the one that curved around the lake and ended near the boat shed, and I stayed there until the sun dipped low and the mosquitoes started biting, thinking about how strange it was to be the one who had always been expected to stay silent and small, and now be the one who held the thread that could unravel everything. And maybe that's why I did what I did next. Not out of spite or even strategy, but out of this strange, bittersweet clarity that came from knowing I wasn't alone anymore. The next morning, while Mom was still in her robe and Emily was complaining about the humidity, I walked into the kitchen, opened the drawer where she kept the property paperwork, and pulled out the folder marked Marina title, the one with the documents for the yacht. I walked over to Dad, handed it to him and said, Let's put my name on it too, just so we're all accountable. He looked at me, confused at first, then understanding dawned, and he smiled, a real one, tired but sincere, and nodded. We walked into the living room together where Mom and Emily were pretending to be relaxed, sipping coffee like the past 2 days hadn't cracked their world open, and I handed Mom the newly signed form. It's under both names now, I said, keeping my voice even. So if there are any future scratches or disagreements, we can all take responsibility. Mom stared at the paper like it was a dead rat I'd dropped in her lap. Emily scoffed, muttering something about lawyers. But Dad stood beside me, and for the first time in a very long time, he didn't try to smooth anything over. And I could tell Mom didn't know what scared her more, losing control of the situation or realizing she no longer knew who was really pulling the strings. But just as I thought the day would end quietly, with everyone retreating to their corners to regroup, my phone buzzed, one of those low, long vibrations that comes with a message you're not quite ready to open. And when I looked at the screen, my stomach dropped, because it wasn't from a friend or a coworker or even a nosy cousin. It was from the clinic. And the subject line was one word: results. The moment I saw the message on my phone, the one from the clinic, that stark and silent notification with its single-word subject line that seemed to echo louder than any voicemail or confrontation we'd had all week. I felt the temperature in the room drop, Not literally, of course, because the air was still thick with the tail end of summer and the scent of brewed coffee. But inside me, something shifted, like the tightrope I'd been walking had suddenly narrowed, the stakes beneath it rising higher, more treacherous than anything I'd prepared for when I wrote that letter to my father, or when I played Mom's voice through the speakers, or even when I'd casually rewritten the yacht ownership documents under the guise of shared accountability. And as I stood there, in that oversized living room with its worn carpet and too many throw pillows, holding my phone like it might burn a hole through my skin, I knew in the way you know storms are coming long before the clouds roll in, that this final truth was mine alone to bear, at least for now. I didn't open the message right away. That would have been too easy, too direct, and honestly, I wasn't ready to know. Not while Mom was still staring at me like I'd grown a second head, and Emily was feigning indifference so poorly it was practically another tantrum. So I slid the phone into my pocket, forced a smile so faint it barely qualified, and excused myself with a vague mumble about needing to take a walk, needing some air, needing anything that didn't involve being in that room a second longer. I think Dad wanted to come after me, to ask if I was okay, but something, maybe the weight of everything that had happened, or maybe just finally understanding that I needed space, kept him rooted to the spot, his eyes tracking me as I moved past him and out onto the back deck. The walk didn't last long. The lake trail was familiar and winding and mostly empty this time of day, except for the occasional jogger or an older couple walking their dog. And it gave me just enough distance from the house to breathe, to try and slow my heartbeat down to something that didn't sound like a war drum. I walked until I reached the old wooden bench near the inlet, the one Dad used to take me to when I was a kid, and everything felt too big to explain. Math problems, mean girls at school, the realization that being the older sibling didn't come with medals or applause, just expectations and silence. I sat there, the wood still warm from the afternoon sun, and finally pulled out my phone to open the email. The results weren't dramatic. No flashing warnings, no bright red flags, just a surreal PDF attachment from the clinic, a digital summary of my recent blood work and genetic screening, something I'd done a few weeks back because of the headaches, the forgetfulness, the way I'd recently found myself standing in the middle of a room with no idea why I'd gone in there. I'd laughed it off at first. Stress, burnout, maybe too much wine. But when it kept happening, I got scared. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't want sympathy, didn't want that awful brand of concerned glances or whispered phone calls that follow you when people think something's wrong. I just wanted to know, just in case. So I opened the file, scanned the lines, searching for the parts I understood, the ones they always bold or flag. And there it was, a POI-4, high-risk indicator, early onset markers, recommendations for neurologic follow-up. It didn't outright say it, not yet, but it didn't have to. I could read between the lines, and those lines were clear. I had inherited something from Dad, something that had been slowly, quietly pulling him away from us, and now it had its grip on me too. I didn't cry. I didn't even flinch. I just sat there, letting the truth settle like sediment in water, watching the ripples fade across the lake, and thought about all the things I hadn't said, all the years I'd wasted playing small to keep the peace. And then, strangely, I laughed, not because it was funny, but because somehow, in the middle of all this mess, I felt stronger than I ever had. I went back to the house an hour later, composed, calm, and with a decision already made. I found Dad in the kitchen, slicing peaches like he used to when I was a kid. And without preamble, I told him everything, the tests, the results, the implications. He didn't interrupt. He just listened, his hands slowing over the cutting board. And when I finished, he put the knife down, turned to me, and said, "Then we go through it together, one day at a time." And just like that, the last card was on the table. That night, I didn't join the rest of the family on the yacht for the final dinner cruise across the lake. Mom had planned it, of course. Something flashy and ridiculous, with floating lanterns and champagne and a Bluetooth speaker blasting her favorite classy playlist. I said I was tired. Emily didn't even look at me as she walked down the dock, probably relieved to have the spotlight back for a night. But before they left, I slipped into the cabin of the yacht, just for a second, and left something tucked into the drawer beneath the helm. A fresh envelope addressed to Mom, sealed and heavy with the kind of truth she couldn't twist into her favor. Inside was a copy of the test results, not mine, but Dad's. The ones from a year ago she thought no one else had seen. The ones he had quietly kept in his office drawer, hidden in plain sight. Along with it, I included a note that simply read, "You knew, and you chose silence." The next morning, the lake house was quiet. Mom didn't mention the letter. Emily was subdued, almost polite, and Dad made pancakes without missing a step. We ate on the porch like we used to, before things got complicated, before truths came crashing down like waves against a boat too small to hold them. I don't know what comes next. If Mom will finally acknowledge what she's done, if Emily will ever grow into a woman who doesn't need praise to feel real, or if I'll have 5 more good years or 20. But I do know this, they'll remember this reunion. Not because of the yacht or the champagne or the summer sun, but because, for once, the quiet one wasn't quiet anymore. And when Mom read that letter, alone, her reflection caught in the yacht's glossy interior, she didn't say a word, but tomorrow she'll have to.